Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Unlimited Guests, our new series that we're doing. We're bringing on anyone who's willing to talk to us. The first guest that we have is Dr. Austin Freeman. But of course, I am Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And Dr. Austin Freeman is the author of the fantastic book, Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology through Mythology with the Maker of Middle-earth. He holds a Master's of Theology in Theology and History from the University of Edinburgh and a PhD in Systematic Theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's written dozens of book reviews, periodicals, peer-reviewed chapters, and articles over the years, focusing on theology, particularly as seen through fantasy literature. He's currently an adjunct professor at Houston Baptist University, and he's here today to talk to us about the book that we just covered on Season 5, Unlimited Opinions, Tolkien Dogmatics. Dr. Austin Freeman, how are you today?
I am doing fantastic. Thank you guys for having me on.
Oh, thanks very much for joining us. We really, really appreciate you coming on. We're going to get right into it with sort of your background with Tolkien and writing Tolkien Dogmatics, sort of your process there. So I want to ask you, how and when did you sort of first become interested in J.R.R. Tolkien? Do you have any particularly fond memories of reading his books, watching the movies, anything like that? How'd you get into it?
So I think like a lot of people, I got into it fairly young. I had a teacher in elementary school that handed me a book called The Hobbit and said, "Hey, I think you'll like this." And it turned out that I did like it. And I read that, and I read The Lord of the Rings, and then I read The Silmarillion, and then I read Unfinished Tales, and I kept reading and reading. And I just continued to enjoy that world. And that was my sort of introduction to a lot of other fantasy literature that held my attention through high school and college. It wasn't really until I finished my master's degree, actually, that I started to take Tolkien seriously as like an academic enterprise. So I had finished my master's degree at Edinburgh, and I was prepping for my PhD back in the United States. And in terms of credit conversion, there was some like supplementary coursework that I needed to do. And it was sort of boring to me to just sort of tick the boxes on the transcript just so I could get into the PhD program. And so in the meantime, I was trying to keep myself busy, and I started exploring themes of evil in Middle-earth and the way that Tolkien expresses evil in a sort of Augustinian framework of evil as absence. And as I did that, I realized that there was quite a lot of academic literature on Tolkien's studies. And yes, for our listeners, that is a thing. There are actually at least 3 journals of Tolkien studies that people publish these academic articles. And there is a wide world of this out there. And so I was exposed to that after I finished my master's degree. That would have been 2012, 2013. And so I started investigating that the same time I was doing my dissertation. And my dissertation is on like nothing related to this at all. It's on the doctrine of the knowledge of God and scripture and theological paradox. And so there were people that would take bets on how long it would take me to reference J.R.R. Tolkien in my other theological conversations. And it was never very long. So honestly, I was writing this book concurrently with writing the dissertation. And I really feel like this book in many ways is more my dissertation than my dissertation is. This is sort of the thing that I became I guess the go-to source in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of other people that are doing really excellent work in Tolkien studies and even in Tolkien and theology, but there's no other book to my knowledge that deals with not with the spiritual themes of Middle-earth, but with Tolkien as a theologian. And those are 2 different things. And I think that there's a huge debate over to what extent you can read The Lord of the Rings as a Christian text, right? Is Tolkien intending to create a Christian story in the same way that Narnia is, or any of these other, God is not dead, or these other Christian literature. But that's very different than talking about Tolkien the man, Tolkien the Catholic, Tolkien the thinker. And that's kind of what I wanted to cover in this book. Obviously, Middle-earth plays a big role in that. But I wanted to start off, the methodology is the opposite of a lot of other people's approaches. Rather than looking at Middle-earth and trying to extrapolate what Tolkien might have believed, I wanted to start with Tolkien's non-fictional statements, with his letters, his lectures, other things like that, and then see how he instantiated those thoughts into Middle-earth. I think that's a sounder methodology. So that's the way I approach things. And I find that much like Chesterton or Lewis or these other seminal thinkers of around the same time period, he's coming at the same truth from two different angles in a lot of ways. His fictional work and his non-fictional work are often two different trajectories reaching the same endpoint. And I found that really fascinating. And that's sort of broached an entirely new research agenda for me. I don't really work on the knowledge of God or any of that anymore. I'm not now. I do Tolkien and fantasy literature and other stuff like that. So it's been really formative.
No, that's amazing. That's really cool. You kind of touched on a question that I wanted to get into as well. I wanted to ask you sort of what the process of writing Tolkien Dogmatics was like. You kind of went over your methodology a little bit there, but there's so much Tolkien stuff. Like there's just books upon books upon books. What was sort of your process in finding what you needed to cover specific topics? Where did you come from in sort of approaching just this massive, sort of work of literature and writings that Tolkien has?
Yeah. So the big picture answer to that question is I just read everything that he wrote.
It's a good strategy.
Yeah, like in order to do that, it required not just finding the stuff that's like listed on the bibliography on Wikipedia, but really digging deep into any of his notes about recorded conversations that he had in high school. Other secondary literature will give you a report on this particular document that is perhaps unpublished, and then you have to go and dig through the databases and find that document and read it, just in the hopes that perhaps there's a glimpse into his theological thoughts somewhere. And then there's other things that you read and you expect to have like a rich mine of theological insight in there. Like he wrote an article for a journal on it's called Iuaris, the Devil's Coach Horses. And it's a straight philological essay tracing the roots of this particular word. Like, why is this? I think it's like a beetle or something. Why is this thing called the devil's coach horse? And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to get some references to what Tolkien thinks about the devil. And it's just not there. It is a pure philological essay. But then you find some letter that he writes to a 12-year-old girl, and all of a sudden he's talking about the purpose and the meaning of life, and he's like giving counsel to his grandson about like the meaning of the book of Jonah. So you never know where he's going to bring this stuff in. You just have to read everything that he wrote. I took months and months to do that, and while I was doing that, I was highlighting everything that was relevant to the book project, like any sort of theological, philosophical statement that he made, I highlighted and I put into documents, and then I started sorting them based on doctrine. And once I did that, I started to see a picture emerge, because Tolkien is a pretty consistent thinker, and so the ideas that he will deal with in lots of different ways will all sort of orbit the same theme. And then it was just a matter of sort of organizing them and taking this big ball of yarn, right? Like this big, long document of quotes on the doctrine of revelation, for instance, and sort of putting them into a straight line that people could follow.
I mean, that's incredibly impressive. Just again, just the massive amount of writing there. No, it's very fascinating, incredibly fascinating. One could even say one of my favorite things to say on this podcast. It is incredibly fascinating. But no, that's really impressive.
I do have a question. I mean, you mentioned in the book that you're not Catholic, and I'm not going to go into your particular beliefs, but I think Tolkien is of interest to me, and to a lesser extent, Adam, because we're Catholics. And so it's interesting to hear, somebody espouse the Catholic views on religion and God and all that kind of stuff. Was that a challenge for you? Where you say you're not a Catholic, or is there any, or did that interest you? There was maybe a different point of view than how you believed or how you were raised.
Yeah, it was one of my biggest concerns in writing the book, was to portray Tolkien and early 20th century English Catholicism accurately, because I was aware that was not like the world that I traveled in. And so I did a lot of stuff, especially in the chapters on ecclesiology and other things, to make sure that I was presenting things fairly and charitably. Like I say very distinctly at the first chapter of the book, I am not presenting what I think. I'm presenting what Tolkien thinks, and I'm not evaluating it. Right? There are many things in the book that I don't agree with, but I want his voice to come through. Like, this is a project about Tolkien the thinker, not about what Austin Freeman thinks about Tolkien the thinker. And so, I mean, the biases are going to creep in inevitably, but I tried to limit that as much as possible. The places that I work, I am a Protestant that is surrounded by Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, and so I was able to sort of talk to other folks and say, "Hey, does this sound right to you? Have you ever heard this?" Other people like Carl Hostetter, who just came out, Carl Hostetter has worked very closely with Christopher Tolkien and the Tolkien estate in publishing posthumous material. I had several conversations with him talking about, does this sound correct? Is this the right way of phrasing things? I did my own research into primary sources, Catholic documents, like the textbooks that seminarians would be reading, just so I can get the terms right. And I've been very gratified to find that Catholics have seen themselves accurately in the book and say, yeah, I recognize that. I recognize that that's what I believe. Because yeah, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm a Calvinist. Yes, indeed, a Calvinist. I listened to that episode as well.
Flesh.
So yes, in the flesh. So yeah, it was something that I was particularly careful about, to make sure that I was not developing straw man arguments. And there are certain areas in which that was more of a temptation, and certain areas where I think Tolkien, like Lewis, is drawing, because of the form of education that he had prior to the creeping of progressivism into the school systems. Like he draws upon this rich, broad stream of Christian tradition, and so he's drawing from Boethius and Augustine and Aquinas and Anselm, like all of these other figures that the whole tradition, both Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox, would say that they see themselves in. And so with the doctrine of creation, for instance, like there's not much that I want to combat. That's more or less my doctrine of creation. It's only a few areas that I would say that we have differences, that I bring in. This is what Tolkien believed and why he believed it.
No, that's great. And that's really integrity
there
is what that is authorial integrity, not putting yourself into, this is what I believe rather than what Tolkien believes. And as you mentioned earlier, you've had Catholics who say, no, I recognize that. And that's exactly what we had, us two being Catholics is like, no, this is, Catholic tradition. This isn't somebody else saying, this is what I think about Catholic tradition. Of course, I and we and many others, I'm sure, appreciate that. It's fantastic.
That leads pretty directly into your original question, Adam, which is like the reception of the book. Mm-hmm. And it has fallen into more or less two distinct camps. And camp number one has been the religious folks that have said, oh, this is great. We love this. Like I was on Al Cresta's radio show up in Michigan. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Al Cresta. Anyway, so like there have been people like that that have been very appreciative. And then like the other people in the Tolkien Society or other people on Twitter that are more progressive, we would say, that really, really want to resist and prejudge the book as bad. Like for whatever reason, if you're seeing Christianity in Tolkien, you've done something bad somewhere. Like I literally had a conversation with someone last week that said, I have heard that this book is bad. And I said, could you, and it was on a public forum that they were like putting links to the book. And I said, hi, I'm always interested in pushback. Could you tell me what criticisms were leveled at the book? Like in what way is it bad? And they refused to tell me. They said, oh, this was given in confidence. This was a private conversation. I'm like, I'm not asking you to tell me who you talked to. I'm asking you, like, as another person with a PhD, tell me what the criticisms were that were leveled at my academic argument. And they just didn't want to do that. Wow. And to me, draw your own conclusions about whether that means the criticisms have any weight or not. But that struck me as unusual. And so there is another contingent of Tolkien fandom that comes out the gate sort of already with a prejudice, right? Prejudicare. They judge it before they read it. And that's been frustrating. But what I've noticed is that these are the sort of people that want to collapse the distinction between interpretation and reception. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is the way that they want to read Tolkien, the fan reception of Tolkien, whether they want to say Frodo and Sam are in a relationship or any of that sort of stuff. Like they are free to do that, right? Nobody's telling them that there's a particular way that they have to appreciate the works of Tolkien. But you should be responsible in talking about what Tolkien actually meant, mm-hmm. right? The question of authorial meaning is an important one. And so I think the people on the left side of this debate are frequently trying to collapse that distinction, that like if Tolkien's work somehow seems to conflict with what I like, then therefore all of a sudden authorial meaning is like really hard to find, and we have to be careful about talking about things like authorial intent or the original meaning. We need to understand that issues of interpretation are really difficult. I'm like, well, 90% of the time, over 90% of the time, that's not true. Right? We know what authors mean or what speakers mean when they talk. Like
So
the very fact that these people are able to disagree with me demonstrates the fact that they get what I'm doing when I'm communicating. So it's just very strange to me that these issues of authorial intention and skepticism about authorial intention only come up on these issues where Tolkien is differing from the progressive interpreters or receivers themselves. I just think that says something.
No, it's very interesting. It's that sort of death of the author idea where it's, a lot of people are saying, what the author intended didn't matter so much as, what I can essentially do with this work, how I can interpret it myself, and, sort of taking in that stance rather than, what was originally intended. I mean, you see that, of course, all over the place with things other than just Tolkien. It's an increasingly common thing, I think.
I don't want to say that the death of the author movement or the 20th and 21st century like literary criticism, I don't want to say that it's worthless. It's not. Like, it's given us a lot of good things that we need to consider in terms of the process of interpreting texts. Like the community does need to be considered in how we read. But like even Derrida says that there's guardrails on interpretation. Even Derrida says that texts just don't mean whatever we want them to mean. There is still a role for what the author means in that. And so you get this sort of lazy relativism where it says, oh, well, if Tolkien disagrees with me, it doesn't really matter. I'm gonna revise history. I'm gonna do X, Y, or Z in order to make it seem like he does agree with me, because after all, truth is unknowable, and his original intentions, we don't have any explicit statements, and therefore I can project or reconstruct whatever I want. And that's dangerous, right? That's 1984. That's the omnipresent now, where we're just constantly revising history to make it match up with whatever the social mores of the time are. I mean, I have no problem talking about and appreciating people that I disagree with, like, pretty intensely. We talk about me not being a Catholic and recognize Catholics recognizing themselves in sort of things that I write. That's why I appreciate David Hume. David Hume's the greatest atheist of all time. And the reason why he is the greatest atheist of all time is because when he writes about Christians, he's actually writing about what Christians believe and not nonsense, the way that most modern atheists do. Right? David Hume actually considered real doctrine instead of saying, oh, you believe in the sky daddy. Like, nobody talks that way.
It seems like it's such an issue now with just, what sort of mindset you have going into something. And I think that's kind of what you mentioned earlier. It's the people who are just sort of predestined to hate it because they've heard that it's bad. And if it's bad, then that means that they'll hate it. And if they go into it, that mindset, they're going to find all the reasons to hate it. They're not going to give it, the proper thought of actually thinking, okay, well, maybe, Dr. Freeman does have a point. A lot of people will never recognize that if they don't start out with that mindset of, okay, I should actually consider this.
Yeah. Like Tolkien had this little rhyme that he made up when the reviews started coming in. He said, "The Lord of the Rings is one of those things. If you like it, you do. If you don't, then you boo." And I think that's pretty much the way that this book has been received. Again, like, I want to be very clear. This is an academic argument. If you have real critiques to make on the basis of evidence, tell me if it's bad. I am certain that there are areas in this book that I do something wrong. That's the nature of human endeavor. But what I have seen so far has been very disappointing. Like, on any of my interviews, people comment on, like, oh, his hair looks really dumb, or oh, he's chubby, or something like it's name calling. And I have yet to see a single substantive critique that is based in the documentary evidence. And I welcome that. Somebody accused me of saying, oh, you just hover around and comment on anybody that doesn't give you a glowing review. No, I don't. But also, if you're going to critique somebody in academic discourse, then back it up.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who also has, sort of long hair and things like that, I appreciate you saying that it's not all about the appearances when you do something like this. People should focus on the actual work. And that actually leads into another question that I had for you. I've been following some of the feedback on this book, especially on Twitter and things like that. And a lot of people have gotten very upset, or relatively upset in Twitter terms, but about your appearance on the Babylon Bee podcast, of course, a conservative Christian satire website that hosts podcasts and things like that. It's been somewhat negative, not really because of any of the arguments that you made, but really just more because of the fact that you appeared on a conservative platform. Like, how dare you? And a lot of people like, well, you should have, talked to this people. You should, reach out to more, left-leaning people. One Twitter user, made this exact point, claiming that you've only appeared on right-wing outlets and you need to branch out to discussing with other groups, such as the Tolkien Society, which you mentioned earlier. So the question that I really have for you is do you think that there is still room in such groups for looking into the more traditional Catholic ideas of Tolkien, or is modern scholarship too focused on always finding something new to say in older works, and you wouldn't really be invited to those platforms anyway?
That's a great question. So I'll say this from the outset. I have had several good conversations with Tolkien Society people since the book has come out. I have also faced unjust criticism and personal attacks. So that was sort of what I expected. The first thing is I go to the places that invite me. Like Babylon Bee reached out to me. Mere Fidelity reached out to me, like all these other places. Those are the ones that are interested in what I have to say. None of the other outlets have even know that I exist, I would say. Like, so is it my fault, or is it their fault, or is it nobody's fault? I have other things to do in my life. I teach full time. I'm not out here to go to a ton of conferences. Like I'm a classical school teacher. Like I don't have that sort of time in my schedule to do a lot of those things. So I appear on podcasts like this, and I appear on other interviews that I can do quickly. But I also go where I'm wanted. And if a left-leaning podcast wanted me to come on their show, I would be happy to come on their show and talk to them. But nobody is interested. Should I be applying to the Tolkien Society in order to make my views more public? Maybe, but from what I've seen of the sort of people that have been on the ascendant in the Tolkien Society recently, and this is not everyone. I want to be very clear. This is not everybody. There is a vocal group of people that see me as some sort of a monster. Because I am a Christian, or even more brutally, because I'm an evangelical Christian. Like the same person that accused me of only going on right-wing podcasts and not presenting at the Tolkien Society was the person that was like calling me names. So
of course,
why would I go there?
Right.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's just absurd to me, how common this is. And this is kind of one of the exact things that you talked about on that same podcast that people are now criticizing, sort of that idea of modern writers, covering Tolkien or other authors, in that they're always just focused on finding something new to say. And that kind of goes back to what we're talking about, but the death of the author, and that, everybody just wants to put their new spin on something, at least as far as I've seen. Do you think that is true still within a lot of, academic media and things like that? Is that sort of the approach that a lot of people are taking?
Yes, 100%. That is the nature of the beast. So in academia right now, you are graded for tenure based on your publication record and your teaching record. And depending on the institution, one weighs more heavily than the other. And so the way that you make a name for yourself and the way that you become a somebody is by figuring out what's wrong with what other people have had to say, or, coming up with some new and revolutionary interpretation of this is something about the New Testament that nobody has ever noticed before. Well, usually that means it's nonsense, because we've been interpreting the New Testament for 2,000. The greatest minds in the world have been interpreting this document for 2,000 years. I doubt you've picked up on anything that is really essentially new. We can keep moving knowledge forward, but those sorts of claims are automatically, I'm automatically skeptical of them. So it's a lot of it is just falling victim to the tenure machine. Or to the desire for becoming a someone, becoming a name. The careful, small scale scholarship is not rewarded right now. It's certainly not the way that it was in the Middle Ages and in the other documents that influenced Tolkien and his ilk. There is a place for that, and honestly, like the more that I'm in academia, the more that I'm exposed to it. And again, my perspective is inherently limited. So other people have different experiences, I'm sure. the more that I have been around the sort of arguments that are made in the humanities and in classics and in this other stuff, the more I'm convinced that the actual real scholarship is being done in the evangelical and Catholic institutions and not in the big universities.
Well, I have a caveat that I don't know if the Catholics are doing anything now. The Catholic institutions have been co-opted, especially if you're talking about the Jesuits. They're just awful. That's
well, yeah, with the Jesuits are their own thing. We don't need to talk about the Jesuits, but there's some great Catholic thinkers that are doing great work right now. And I really appreciate them. There's a book that just came out that sort of bridges our divide. There's a book by some folks at University of Edinburgh and at the from Amsterdam, talking about neo-Calvinism and Roman Catholicism that literally just came out a month ago. Appreciation of folks from the 20th century like Hans Urs von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac and other Catholic thinkers that there are things happening. Theology is not completely bankrupt. You just have to know where to look. And the humanities are not completely bankrupt. You just have to know where to look. And I think that goes back to the same issue we've been talking about this whole time. Do you believe that there is a true or false in interpretation? If you don't believe that interpretation can be wrong, then you're free to say whatever sort of shallow nonsense you want. And you can talk about I have read so many bad takes on Tolkien, and not just on Tolkien, on other things like the Jungian archetypes about what does this mean when they go down into Moria and he faces the Watchers in the water. Is this some sort of return to the womb? No, it's not. That's not what Tolkien was doing. He needed a monster there. But this is the state of a lot of humanities research and social science research as well, because it's non-falsifiable. People are not interested in truth or falsity anymore, by and large. And I'll say this again. I'll say this, Mark. I want to take a little small tangent here on the issue of calling people doctor.
Oh no!
We know that there were 3 original doctorates, right? I'm sure you're a JD, you know this, right? There were 3 original doctorates.
Nobody calls me doctor.
Well, no, they don't. And honestly, I don't know why. Historically, I don't know why that has dropped away with the lawyers. But it was medicine, law, and theology.
Yeah, lawyers are humble, so we don't want to be called.
Sure. I don't insist that anybody calls me doctor. It's on my Twitter handle because the other ones were taken. Just FYI. But I would say, not for myself, but for my fellow theologians, that a PhD is certainly an accomplishment. I don't have that same certainty about other forms of doctorate. So the PhD, the MD, the JD, right? Those are the classics. Those are the OGs. The other proliferation of doctorates is to me on a case-by-case basis.
Well, the doctor of education, if I really have a crisis, I'm going to call a doctor of education to solve whatever that problem could be.
So here's the issue. It's the same thing. All these other doctorates in social sciences and other stuff. And again, I'm not saying that people with these doctorates are not smart or not intelligent, but I've read a lot of these things, and they're more or less non-falsifiable.
Right.
And that's definitely something that I've experienced. I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm a linguistics major up at Truman State University. And so a lot of the linguists nowadays, they just get so focused at looking at words that they think everything's words. And you get really into this idea of, everything's a social construct. Nothing is true or false. Everything's just what people say. Everything's just what people do. It's very socially based and sort of construed as, nobody can really be wrong because it's all just words anyway. It's all just things that we've made up. It seems like in a lot of fields, like you're saying, with the humanities, with the social sciences, it's just this idea of there's nothing higher than just, everything's socially made up. There's no higher truth. There's no higher meaning. And sort of with that, I wanted to kind of tie that back into what you were saying earlier, and that a lot of the good, writing is coming from these religious institutions. Do you think that idea is tied to the fact that these are religious institutions that would presumably, attract people that do believe in a higher meaning, that are looking for an objective truth? Do you think that those things are tied?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also tied to the rise in classical schools, charter schools, homeschooling, all of this sort of stuff. Like there are metaphysical commitments to education. Education is intrinsically teleological, right? It has a purpose to it automatically. And so if you don't believe that there is a purpose to the human person or to human existence, then what is the purpose of education? Well, it must be to get you some sort of job that's going to make you a lot of money. Going to make you into a cog in the economic machine that is going to orient you towards selfishness and towards consumerism. But if you are a part of an educational tradition that believes that the purpose of the human person is virtue and truth and beauty, all of these things, to aim towards the transcendent, well, that's a very, very different form of education from the ground up. All of the people, the linguistics folks, the Saussure and all those folks, go back and read Augustine, read his De Magistro. The distinction between words and things is fundamental, but the distinction between words and things implies that there is a reality outside of our perception. And if you've imbibed Kant and his sort of recentering of reality on your own subjective human consciousness, then people don't care about that anymore.
No, that's an excellent point. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, actually, that there is this other reality that we can't see. Unfortunately, our time with you is winding down, so I want to ask you just one more question before you have to go.
Wait
of course,
wait a second. I want to say something.
Feel free. Jump in.
So two things. One is I literally couldn't tell. No, literally, maybe I shouldn't say that. I couldn't tell what your religious or philosophical beliefs were from reading the book, and that's almost always what I want to know. So you did an excellent job of keeping yourself out of the way of the subject material. And then I just want to make that comment. The second thing is you really are a talented writer. How you turn the phrase and just how you express yourself. And maybe I'm stealing Adam's last question, but have you ever wrote like fiction? Are you thinking about doing it in the future? Do you have a novel that you have on a bookshelf somewhere?
I forget whether it was you or Adam in the last episode that said, I bet at least in high school he did some of this stuff.
I think,
Who was that?
I think I said that.
That was
didn't
you.
I?
Yeah,
that is exactly what happened. So yes, I had some stuff that I worked on in high school. I love D&D and I like world building and all that sort of thing, but I don't have any fictional projects that I'm working on right now anywhere other than in my mind. Like I have several premises for stories, but I'm so in awe of the task of crafting good fiction that I feel like I'm just like, that's not my business. I don't want to transgress out of my little wheelhouse. I don't know, maybe someday. But yeah, I that is something that I experimented with, and I think everybody should. I think everybody that works on literary criticism or any of these other academic modes that talk about fiction needs to try it. Otherwise, you're not going to understand what it's about. It's one of those things that really does need to be experienced in order to fully comprehend it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you unsolicited advice. You ought to really put an effort into it, because I think we're at a loss if you don't do it.
Well,
Mark, I think it's our loss if you don't do it. You have a talent.
Okay.
Do it.
I will take that under advisement.
Absolutely. I want to just bleed that into the very last question, then we can let you go. You said fictional writings upcoming, unfortunately, although I'm sure we'll be the first to buy a copy if that ever happens. But are there any other writings or projects that you'll be publishing soon, or where else can people find you to keep updated on what you're doing?
Sure. So Twitter is the place. I specifically got on Twitter after many, many years, just in order to have a place where people can go to track my appearances. It's a professional necessity nowadays. So I have another book coming out that I have edited along with another gentleman on theology, fantasy, and the imagination. My chapter in that is on sins of the imagination and in what sense a fantasy literature can be sinful. So I'm looking at you, Game of Thrones, and other places like that. Like, what is the difference between Game of Thrones and Tolkien? So that's out recently, or it will be out fairly soon. I have another chapter in a Blackwell volume on Ted Lasso and philosophy. I don't know if you guys have watched Ted Lasso. I know you like your media recommendations. So on that is another Catholic writer. I'm talking about Ted Lasso and G.K. Chesterton's optimism. And then after that, I can't think of anything that's coming out really soon or anything that I have under contract. So watch this space. My longer term project is an examination of angelology and demonology, which I think is becoming increasingly important in our world. Right, those sorts of conversations are going to be really important, I think, in the next few years, as we see that become more and more explicit in our society. Right, we're in a lot of ways we're regressing backwards into Rome and other sophisticated pagan cultures. But there's so much signal to noise ratio in terms of those books. Like if you go on Google Books and just find some books on demonology or angelology, like most of it is not recommended. So I think there's a necessity for some solid like primary source readers in the church fathers and in the medievals to sort of recover that doctrine. That's a longer term project that I'm working on.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We'll be sure to keep an eye on that. I'll definitely be checking that out. I can't speak for you, Dad, but we'll see if you check it out. But no, that's amazing.
I forgot one. There's two other volumes for Walking Tree Press, which is sort of like the premier academic Tolkien publisher. So I have a chapter in one on Tolkien and Romanticism, where I tried to construe Tolkien as part of a school of British theological Romanticism alongside C.S. Lewis, G. Kitterton, William Morris, John Ruskin, other folks like that. So that's more about the background to Tolkien. And then we had a symposium at Houston Christian University, where I work, on Tolkien among the theologians, which was last November, and Walking Tree has agreed to publish that as well. I don't even think that's up on their website yet, but that's in process. And just so I can make everybody mad, my chapter, I will be editing that, but my chapter on that is on 5 convergences between Tolkien and Calvin.
Oh. Oh man, that's quite a note to end on. You've forever angered my dad, I think. No, but thank you very much for coming on. We're going to wind things down here. I'll include a link to Tolkien Dogmatics in the description of this podcast, available on all platforms. Anyone who hasn't checked it out yet, who's been listening to the past 13 episodes of Unlimited Opinion, should absolutely take a look at that book. A fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough. But thank you very much, Dr. Austin Freeman, for joining us in the very first episode of Unlimited Guests. It's been great to have you on. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
And this has been Dr. Austin Freeman talking to us today.